Well, as I said last week, we will always start a class with a question that I cannot answer. Well, I couldn't answer this question, and what I found out in a little bit of research was indeed this picture was created in England in 1877. So that's when that was first come. Now you're probably wondering, well, why were the English anti-Russian in 1877? Well, you may remember that the Crimean War was in the 1850s. So the British and the Russians did not always get together in a really friendly manner, particularly at that time. And it was done, this version of it was done by a Japanese college student. So it wasn't like it was a presentation from the Japanese government. This was actually done by a college student in Japan. The other thing I wanted to talk about from last week, and I may not have stressed this enough, is that if you think about Japan being a feudal society and going from a feudal society to a world power with they had no industrial revolution, anything. In 37 years, they went from nothing to a world power. That's an incredible amount of progress, and it's pretty much unprecedented in world history. The other thing is, when they did that, they completely changed the role of the emperor at that particular time. Remember, under the Tokugawa shogunate, the emperor was really just a religious figure. Now the emperor has become vastly more than that, and that's primarily what the key part of today's lecture will be. And the other thing is, the first emperor, Jimmu, was portrayed in the year 712 as a warrior emperor. So please keep that in mind as we go along today. All right, we'll first talk about kokutai, that is national polity. Kokutai is interpreted in two different ways in Japan after the Meiji Restoration. The first way is that the Japanese nation is a racial as well as a typical state type of entity. So the Japanese are in a unique position because they are ruled by a divine being. And their legends and the Shinto religion tie into this, and it is basically the legends of their origin are historical fact. And that is what is so different about Japan, is that they are the progenitors of the human race. They are ruled by a divine being. So that's and remember the rising sun, the goddess Amaterasu. So that's one of the examples of kokutai. The other one is that you can understand the kokutai as being, how would I put it, an organ of the emperor is an organ of the state. He's the head of the state. He's basically kind of like a body part. So the state itself is supreme. The emperor is just the head of that state. So if you look at it that way, that would be more of a typical constitutional monarchy. The other problem with the organ theory, as this is called, is during the 30s and 40s, if you support the organ theory, this can be extremely bad for your health. You may be murdered. So the simplest version of kokutai, in a one-sentence thing, is kokutai, or national polity, meaning the uniqueness of the Japanese people in having a leader with spiritual origins. It's a simple one-sentence idea of national polity. But for the fascist nationalist clique that developed into Japan in the 30s and 40s, it means significantly more. It became a convenient term for indicating all the ways in which they believed that the Japanese nation, as a political as well as racial entity, was simultaneously different and superior to all other nations on earth. So they've taken this religious figure from the 1860s, and now we have transformed it into a god emperor that is indeed a warrior in a very short time. So all these things are fundamental to a thing called the imperial way. And we're going to talk significantly today about the imperial way. The imperial way basically is of spiritual aspects of the Japanese polity. It is, and I'll read it again, so that all of humanity can share the advantage of being ruled by the Tenno, Tenno being emperor. So that is what Kokutai is, and this will become incredibly important at the end of the war. There's another term that we're going to talk about today, and that's Gekkokujo, and that means basically government from below. Now, I don't want you to interpret Gekkokujo as being like Gandhi or perhaps Martin Luther King, where it would be, passive resistance, dissent of, problems. It wouldn't be really like that. Gekkokujo is done by the Japanese military, so it's done by a portion of the state. And if you don't believe what the Gekkokujo people feel is the proper thing, the development of Japan as a great state, the development of Japan as being morally correct, automatically morally correct because it's got the divine emperor, well, then you are subject to, as I talked about last week, compassionate killing. So there's a far difference between what Gekkokujo is, where a moral principle supersedes government of law, than what we would perhaps think about it today with people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King. It's used as a justification by, again, military people, mid-level and junior officers, to achieve things that they feel are more important than the state. And we'll see how this goes along today in regards to how that fits in with perhaps the Depression. So they're really concerned about this. They blame the democratic government of Japan. Remember that Japan did have a diet, and it did have a prime minister on top of, below the emperor in effect. So there was an elected government of Japan, but they blamed the Depression on capitalism and on the government of Japan being democratic. So they felt that democracy and capitalism had failed the Japanese people. And you may remember from last week as well that the Japanese had tremendous amount of success during World War I as far as economics. They sold things to the Allies. So there was tremendous amount of prosperity in Japan previous to this. And then all of a sudden the Depression hits, and bam, their economy's in the toilet. So they're very, very, the Japanese people and the Japanese military are very unhappy about this. Well, acts of Gekkokujo continued throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s. Gekkokujo allows for them to perhaps invade China. It allows for them to invade Manchuria. It allows for them to kill prime ministers. It allows for them to kill Zaibatsu. A Zaibatsu is a Japanese industrialist, a capitalist in effect. So Gekkokujo is used, again, moral principle supersedes law. And the biggest piece with this is they're trying to get Japan to achieve its rightful place among the nations of the world. Rightful is a key word. The other thing we talked about last time was that Siberia had indeed been occupied by the Japanese army. And the Japanese army was forced to give Siberia back by the Japanese democratic government. So consequently, what happened is the Japanese army did not forget this. They don't forget this at all. They are well aware that they were humiliated by the democratic government and were forced to give back something that they felt was rightfully there, which was Siberia. So the effect of Gekkokujo on the government is to make the military eventually the dominant force in politics in Japan, particularly by 1940. So by 1940, you will see the democratic government of Japan is completely superseded by a military government. The Japanese also are incredibly anti-communist. If you think about anarchy, and this is like a duplicate, fits together. It's not duplication, but the anarchists and the communists at this particular time, 1908, remember the Russian Revolution has not occurred yet. So anarchists, if you think about Russia, had spent a number of times hunting czars. Anarchists hunted czars. They killed czars. They attempted to kill czars. So needless to say, the Japanese, being a realm of imperialists, of an imperial realm with an emperor, they are not at all in favor of having anybody around that hunts or is a regicide, if you want to put it that way. So that's another key thing here. So they are incredibly tense about anybody that will threaten the Kokutai. So they have an incident. It's a small incident, really, just a little gathering of people are pro-communism and pro-anarchism, and they have a little rally, and the Japanese government comes down on them hard, very hard, arrests some of them, and some of them are sent to prison. Well, what happens a couple years later is we have the high treason incident. And the high treason incident, the Japanese government finds out that there is a plot to kill Emperor Meiji. He's still alive. Remember, he was a very young boy when he became emperor. And they are convinced that this is a threat to the Kokutai, to the imperial realm, and consequently they come down incredibly hard on these people, and they do what many times you hear about in situations like this. They round up the usual suspects. So there were maybe 6 people that were actually involved in this plot, but they rounded up, I think it was 24, or 26, excuse me. 12 of those 26 are executed, even though they had absolutely nothing to do with this. And the first woman in modern Japanese history is also executed. She was a journalist. So they came down incredibly hard on this. Well, the high treason incident leads to another suppression of democratic ideas, and that is the peace preservation laws. So the peace preservation laws came about in 1924, and what they basically said is it was against the law in Japan for you to have any idea that you should have not personal property, so basically anti-communist. So if you thought that personal property was bad, then you expressed that, then you were breaking the law. You would not be able to have any kind of communist or socialist organizations, and it actually got to the point where it was almost anti-democratic. In other words, if you had any thoughts whatsoever that the Toko, or the emperor, was not the supreme ruler of Japan, or you should be able to vote against that, then indeed you had broken the law. And the way they supported this law was a thing called the Toko, and the Toko were what we would refer to as thought police. So if you expressed any comments that were anti-emperor, capitalism, then indeed you were subject to be arrested, and many people were. Well, that gets us to Manchuria. And this is an interesting thing, that the Japanese army is split into 2 factions. So there's 2 factions. The first one is the Imperial Way faction, and the second one is the Control faction. The Imperial Way faction is totally about spirituality. They believed that it was more important for troops to have high morale and be willing to die for the emperor than it was for those troops to be armed with tanks and cannon. So they basically thought that spirituality would overcome firepower. Simple enough. And they also thought heavily that the national polity was incredibly important, the imperial realm was incredibly important, and most of all, their goal was to get back at Russia. They wanted to attack Siberia. The control faction is significantly different, and we would look at them more, even though this is previous to Germany, you would look at them more as the German army. They were very much concerned about mechanization, armaments, a very controlled economy, but mostly what the control faction wanted to do was to invade China. They thought that indeed the way for Japan to become truly a great world power was for them to capture China. So you got two separate pieces here that are very, very divergent. Well, in 1929, the Russians, the Red Army, has a minor war with China. And the Red Army actually at this time proves itself to be a modern army and very, very much a force to be reckoned with. This comes as a surprise to people in the West. That indeed the Chinese army was supposed to be okay. It wasn't great, but it was certainly, they didn't think the Red Army would crush it the way they did. And they take control of the CER, the Chinese Eastern Railroad, which is in Mongolia. And they create a thing called the Mongolian People's Republic. So in other words, there's a Mongolian puppet state that is controlled by Japan. Well, the Kwantung Army, and let me back this up a little bit just so you understand. The Kwantung Army is the Japanese army that's stationed in North Korea. And you're going to hear this term a lot, Kwantung Army, today. And they are primarily controlled by the Imperial Way faction. This is one of the strongholds of the Imperial Way. The other one is in the 1st Division, which is normally stationed near Tokyo. So there's two big power bases for the Imperial Way faction. So the Imperial Way faction sees that Russia, Soviet Union, has now gotten much more power closer to Manchuria with the fact that they've created this puppet state, and they become very, very concerned that the Russians are going to get into Manchuria, and they make the decision that they need to get to Manchuria first. They're not going to let them have it. They create the famous Mukden incident, and I think this one's pretty funny, really, if you think about it, because what they do is they stage an incident where theoretically the Chinese have blown up a Japanese-controlled railway. Well, they didn't use a lot of explosives. So, in fact, it did so little damage to the railway that 2 hours later, a Japanese freight train full of troops rolls over the tracks that were just theoretically blown up. So, it's a pretty minor thing. But they thought it would be enough to create an incident that they could then follow up on and then begin to capture Manchuria. Well, this is totally against direct orders from Imperial Japanese headquarters in Japan. The Kwantung Army and the Imperial Way faction does this completely on their own. They just like, well, we don't need the government. You know, we know what's best. We'll have a little Gekko-kujo for everybody here. And they invade Manchuria, and they are incredibly victorious. They just go down the railroad and just keep taking more and more of Manchuria. And you can see that there is Manchuria right up there, in case you don't know. So the Japanese government, they're shocked by this. They're like, what are you guys doing? But when they see how successful this is going, they decide, you know, maybe this Gekko-kujo is not such a bad idea. Let's send in 3 more divisions and let's capture Manchuria. And that's what they do. So Chinese public opinion is incredibly mad about this, but they're more almost mad at their own government because the Chinese army basically does nothing to stop the Japanese. They basically just pull out and say, you know, you can have it. And they actually outnumber the Japanese. So it's really amazing to me that they put up absolutely no fight for Manchukuo whatsoever, for Manchuria at all. So the Japanese consolidate their gains and they create the new puppet state of Manchukuo. Now Manchukuo will be, the head of state for Manchukuo will actually be the former emperor of China, who was deposed previously by Sun Yat-sen. He is now a young man, and he is made theoretically head of state, even though it's a Japanese puppet government, and he's running Manchukuo. So the other thing that happens too is the United States totally fails to recognize this. They have a thing called the Stimson Doctrine, and the Stimson Doctrine is the fact that any territory that Japan conquers will never be recognized by the United States as a legitimate state. The League of Nations condemns the Japanese and says, you know, you guys were bad, and you can't be doing this, and yada, yada, yada. And guess what happens then? The Japanese say, well, you know what? Well, screw you. We aren't going to be in the League of Nations anymore. We'll just do what we want. And that's exactly what they do. So that brings us to the 15th of May incident. Things become more and more and more violent in Japan as we go along. So you may remember last time we talked about the Washington Treaty of 1921 with the naval treaty, and that was in regards where Japan got 3 battleships, the US got 5 battleships, and the British got 5 battleships. Well, in 1930 there's another London Naval Agreement, and the London Naval Agreement basically ratifies these same issues for another 10 years and actually puts more restrictions on cruisers and submarines at this time. So it's actually even more restrictive. Now the Japanese government actually wants this because they can't afford an arms race. Remember, this is the Depression going on. So they really don't want to get into an arms race. They don't really have any money. So, but the people in the Imperial Way faction really don't see it that way. They really think that this is a problem, and they want the government to be overthrown, and they want to do a thing called the Showa Restoration. Now here's another piece that we're going to have to remember, is that Showa is the name of Hirohito's reign. So in Japanese, Showa means, this is kind of humorous, enlightened peace. So the emperor's reign, enlightened peace, is going to be fortified by these young officers who are going to basically try to overthrow the democratic government of Japan. So they are joined by this group called the League of Blood, and these guys are incredibly violent. They kill the head of the Mitsui Corporation. They shoot democratic politicians. They're basically thugs, really. And on May 15th, 11 of these officers decide what they're going to do is they're going to go to the Prime Minister's house. They're going to execute the Prime Minister. They're also going to kill his house guest, Charlie Chaplin. I know, I'm not making this up. I know, it seems like I must be, but they're going to kill Charlie Chaplin, and that's going to show the world that they're going to have a show of restoration. And then after they do that, of course, they're going to go to the police station and surrender themselves. Well, fortunately for Charlie Chaplin, he went with the Prime Minister's son to a sumo wrestling match that night. He's not home, and he survives the war. So good for Charlie Chaplin. But unfortunately for Prime Minister Sushi, I can't pronounce that name. But anyway, the Prime Minister is dead. They shoot him, and he's done for. So the naval officers go on trial, because remember, they turn themselves in, and they use the trial as a pedestal, a pulpit, so they can give out their thoughts to the Japanese people about how they want to get rid of the evil democratic government and the capitalist government people that have caused the Great Depression. They get 350,000 Japanese to sign a petition that they should be let go. There's a group of students, 11 students, that say if they're sentenced to death, they will take their place. And just to show you how serious we are, each one of them cuts off a finger and mails it to the judge. Well, the Japanese government really doesn't know how to respond to this because they're getting such a groundswell of support for these officers that they all get like basically a slap on the wrist. They get a couple of years in prison and that's it for murdering the prime minister of the country. So you can see how Gekkokujo probably isn't a lot like Gandhi. Well, then we have the October incident. So now one of the key officers of the Kwantung Army, Imperial Way faction, of course, abandons his post, goes to Tokyo, tries to create a revolution, gets a bunch of other officers involved, tries to get some troops involved, but he is suppressed, and for his actions, he receives 20 days of home confinement, and the other people that helped him are assigned to other posts. Now, needless to say, I think if you and I went and tried to overthrow the government of the United States, and we were in the military and we abandoned our posts, we would probably get more than 20 days of house suspension, house confinement. So it's pretty amazing how light these sentences are. Well, things are going to change because now we have the 226 incident of 1936. And what's critical about this one is they want to create a militaristic state socialist system. And who has been doing that? Nazi Germany. So Nazi Germany, because of their spending, wild spending I may add, on trying to end the Depression by building up their military, has basically put their people back to work, and there is quite a bit of prosperity, short term, in Germany. So these military folks in the Imperial Way decide that this must be the right thing to do, so we need to overthrow the government and create a German-style economy. So there'll be no parties, there'll be only the military and the emperor. They again want to focus on the USSR, and it's a major challenge to the hegemony of the Asian mainland. Again, that's always what they want to do. They always want to go after Russia. So there's this famous Aizawa incident. There's a Japanese general fires another Japanese general who's a key focus of the Imperial Way. And this Colonel Aizawa gets so mad about this that he walks into this guy's office and kills him. He shoots him. And his trial becomes another one of these media sensations. He was just doing the right thing. He was just trying to make the country better. And he's portrayed, I love this line, a simple soldier who sought only to reform the army and the nation according to the true national principle. Which is, obviously it's okay if you kill people if you're doing that for the right reason. Well, it doesn't quite work out for him because he is found guilty and he is executed. But that comes a little later, because what's going to happen first is the Imperial Way faction decides now is the time for them to have their revolution, because they've got the people stirred up on the Aizawa incident, and they find out that the key 1st Division is going to be transferred from the Tokyo area to Manchuria. So they will no longer be in a position where they can exercise power against the government. So they figure, well, we got to make a move, and the move is going to be right now. So what happens is then, is the officers would assassinate the most prominent enemies. They would create a government with the guy that was deposed, the Mizaki guy, as the new premier. And You know, it's all about the emperor, but you know what? If the emperor doesn't really want to go along with this, maybe we'll have his brother, Prince Chichiba, become the emperor. So it's like, okay, you're doing this for the emperor, but if the emperor doesn't want you to do it, then we're going to get a new emperor. I mean, it just really doesn't make a lot of sense. But so they get, remember now, these are officers in a division around Tokyo. So they basically have control of a lot of troops. So they get 1,558 troops to become this thing called the Righteous Army. And what do? They immediately take over the radio stations, the newspapers, the police station, and they surround the imperial palace. This is a serious effort at a coup. The emperor, when he finds out about this, is like, whoa, this is bad. You know, we got to do something about this. Well, the government's like, well, you know, maybe we shouldn't do anything, and maybe we should get a new cabinet, and blah, blah, blah. And you know, the government actually says, well, you know, maybe we should just resign. And the emperor's like, no, you're not going to resign. I'll let you resign after we put the rebellion down, but first we're going to put down the rebellion. You guys can't just walk away from this thing and allow this to be going on anymore. I mean, it's getting kind of bad in Japan where you're constantly killing, you know, major politicians in Zaibatsu. Well, here's who they were going to kill. They were going to kill these guys. They're all big shots. You got the prime minister, you got former prime minister, grand chamberlain. We're not going to go through all these in detail, but you can see why they're going to kill them. You can see London Naval Treaty, Oregon Theory, London Naval Treaty, Oregon Theory. If you, again, don't want to be supporting that Oregon Theory around these guys, and obviously you don't want to be part of party politics, you want to be any of this stuff. So the top 3 guys there, they all survive. They escape from various different ways. The bottom 3 guys, they all die. And the guy in the middle, Suzuki Kantaro, and in English you would pronounce his name Kantaro Suzuki. Suzuki, last names are first in Japanese. He is shot multiple times by the Imperial Way officers, and he's bleeding on the ground, and they're going to finish him off, and his wife intervenes and says, look, just let him die in peace, and I'll take care of it. So they literally salute him and walk out the door. Well, interestingly, he survives multiple gunshot wounds, and in 1945, he is the premier of Japan. He's the prime minister. So he is critical to the end of the war, and that fact that he survives all these gunshot wounds. All right, the emperor, his key advisor, who's another key person at the end of the war, is Koichi Kido, who is a marquis. He is part of the imperial family in a sense. He will also be Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal at the end of the war. He is not at this time. And he's like the emperor's closest confidant. And he tells the emperor, you know what, we cannot allow this to go on any longer. You need to take a hard line on this. And the government and the army are kind of vacillating. They're like, well, maybe we should give in to the rebels. And the emperor says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to personally take control of the Imperial Guards Division, and I'm going to put down the rebellion. And, oh, by the way, I'm going to call the Navy. And he does, and they send 40 ships to the harbor of Tokyo and a bunch of, in effect, Japanese Marines. They're not really Marines, but they're close enough. So he has got now all these troops on his side, and the government is totally cowed by this, by the fact that the emperor himself is going to take control of a division of troops and put down the rebellion. Well, the rebels know now that they are done for. They're in trouble. So, several of the leaders commit suicide, seppuku, ritual suicide, but the others are actually told that, you know, if you just surrender, all crimes will be forgiven. Unfortunately, they may not have been told the truth. But a lot of them then do surrender. Now remember, there's a lot of different people here. There are soldiers that have just been ordered out there, so they're not really, they were told by their superiors, you got to go do this. There are non-commissioned officers that are involved in this, some are more involved than others. And of course you have officers, and then there's several civilians that support this. So how does this look like? So remember there was 1,558 people in the original Righteous Army. A small group, when they first were told to surrender, immediately did surrender and went back to their barracks. Those guys are all off the hook. A lot of the soldiers who were ordered to do this, they're off the hook. So there's only 124 that are actually facing criminal charges on this. And 19 officers, 73 NCOs, and 10 civilians. 43 NCOs, 3 soldiers, all the civilians, and all the officers are found guilty. Now what's different about this trial is in secret, so there will be no show trial or a bully pulpit, or however you want to put it, for them to put out their views. They are not given any defense lawyers. The judges don't care about their opinion of what the government should be like. All they care about is their actions, and consequently 17 of the 19 officers are executed. So the emperor comes down very, very hard on this. It has another effect, though, that's very, very important to the end of the war. Now we're going back a long way here. In 1900, the laws changed where the Japanese government, in order to have a government, you have to have certain people in the government. You have to have an army minister and a navy minister. Well, the military is given control of these positions, and so consequently they can bring down a government anytime they want, or they can stop a government from being formed, because if they don't like the government, all they have to do is say, well, we're not going to give you a navy minister, or we're not going to give you an army minister. So if they don't give you one of those, you cannot form a government. So consequently, they have complete control of how a government will be formed or if it stays in power. Somewhat. But frequently, what they would do is they would put in a retired officer. After the 226 event, that doesn't happen that way any longer. Now these are acting service members that have a superior officer in Imperial Japanese Army headquarters or the Navy headquarters, etc., and they can literally be ordered to take a government down or not to form a government. So we see, because of the 226 incident, that the military has actually gained more power to control the Japanese government than they actually had before the event. Well, the other thing that happens too is the Imperial Wei faction begins to lose most of its power. So the Imperial Wei faction has been defeated, really. But they don't really go away. They're still around, and they will still do things that they probably shouldn't. And the control faction now becomes part of the leading group in the army. And the other thing that happens too is the emperor feels kind of like maybe he overstepped his constitutional authority. So since he feels he overstepped his constitutional authority, he then decides that maybe in the future he shouldn't get that involved in these types of situations. And with that, you have a very short break. The emperor is reluctant to use his voice, so consequently down the road we will see that that becomes a problem. And the way is now open for the control faction to invade China, which they've been wanting to do for a long time. But first we got to talk about that anti-communist Japanese government. So what do? Is they're going to sign the Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936. And where does this come from? Well, Germany has the idea that it would be a really good idea to put Japan and China together so they would oppose the Russians. And, you know, maybe be a little friendlier with us, too. So they would kind of get this block together. Well, the Chinese are like, they know the Japanese are not necessarily their best friends. and they decide that, you know, they really don't want any part of this thing. But the pact is signed primarily the Germans because they're afraid that France and the Soviet Union will get together. Also, it contains secret agreements, and I probably shouldn't, let's back up a second. Just so you understand, the Comintern is not the Soviet Union. The Comintern is the Communist International. And I believed at this time they were stationed in Switzerland. So, this pact is not theoretically against Russia. It is against world communism. Well, it's really about Russia. So they sign a secret agreement that neither power will intervene if there is a war between the other power with Russia, and they will, in quotes, have a benevolent neutrality. In other words, they won't have a strict neutrality. They will have the kind of neutrality where they will still exchange goods and examples. There won't be a blockade. So realistically, it's about that, but it's really about Russia. And the pact is eventually joined by all of the Axis powers and was the first link of Japan and Germany. So you can see that as early as '36, the Japanese government, and as we mentioned previously, that the Japanese military saw the German model of economics being something that they could duplicate and would help them get out of the Depression as well. So again, the Great Depression caused extreme economic hardship in Japan. In order to solve this problem, we're going to need more goods, more materials, and they want to get those, of course, from the Asian mainland. And the government at this time is under a gentleman who I mentioned last week, Konoe. And Konoe was the guy that said that he thought Germany, he was at the Treaty of Versailles, he thought that Germany had the right idea, that they really had legitimate reasons for being in World War I, and that they were a have-not nation like Japan. He says Japan is a have-not nation, and that Germany had the right to try to maintain colonies and get more goods. And I use the term here, Lebensraum, which is the German term for living space. So, again, I've talked about this last time, but the German model where they're going to basically exterminate the Jews and move out the Slavs and do these things that are a little bit more harsh racially than the Japanese. The Japanese consider themselves superior, but they have no desire to exterminate other Asian nations unless, of course, you resist them. If you resist them, then you're supporting the white people. The Chinese government at this time is incredibly chaotic. You have warlords, you have Mao Zedong, you have the nationalist government is trying to make sense out of this mess that they've inherited. And the Japanese, after the Manchukuo incident, the Japanese continue to have incidents with the Chinese. And that leads to the very famous incident of 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge. And that is considered to be the start of the Japanese invasion of China, and many historians feel that that is actually the start of World War II. The Japanese government is told by the Japanese army that not a problem, we will beat the Chinese in 3 months, and the war will be over, and everything will be great. Well, the Japanese win victory after victory. They crush the Chinese, but the damn Chinese just refuse to quit. They just, what's wrong with you guys? They just withdraw finally into China. I'll show a map later on how much territory the Japanese actually have taken. They literally have all the key areas of the Japanese heartland. They have all the major cities along the coast except Hong Kong, which is British. And they have, the Chinese just refuse to surrender. Well, during the war, there's many, many incidents that cause issues with the United States. And probably one of the most important is the Panay incident, Remember, the United States is technically not an imperial power, but we do have a significant amount of investments in China, and we maintain a fleet of gunboats on the Yangtze River. Well, we're trying to evacuate U.S. civilians and U.S. oil tankers. The Japanese Naval Air Force attacks the gunboat Panay and sinks it with significant loss of life. And you can see it here, the Panay is actually underwater there. The Japanese government apologizes to the U.S. for this accident. It was strictly an accident. We didn't mean to sink your ship, sorry. We just got confused. It looked like a Chinese ship to us. And they give us $2 million, and they pay reparations to the dead and injured. Japanese civilians actually start going to the U.S. Embassy in Japan and start trying to donate money, and the people in the embassy have no idea what to do with it. They're like, don't give us money. We don't know what to do with your money. But according to John Prados, the U.S. cryptographers are incredibly good. We are reading Japanese codes again, and we have read the Japanese naval code where these Japanese naval aircraft were told to bomb the Panay. Well, we can't tell the Japanese that because that would give away the secret that we can read their codes. But it's obvious that this is a form of Gekkokujo again. Again, a local level commander has overridden the Japanese government by ordering his aircraft to destroy the Panay. Another huge issue with the United States at this time is the rape of Nanking. What had happened is Nanking was the Chinese capital. It's surrounded by the Japanese, and many of the Japanese are trying to get control of this city, but the Chinese soldiers are taking off their uniforms and trying to blend into the population. This angers the Japanese incredibly, and it is believed that Prince Asaka, who is part of the royal family in Japan, part of the imperial relative of Hirohito, orders that all captives in the city be killed because they can't tell who was a soldier and who was a civilian. So he says, if you catch young guys, kill them. That's not necessarily proved that he said that. It can be debated, but it's very possible. So over 6 weeks, the Japanese rape and pillage and burn and destroy, and over 200,000 civilians or military are executed in Nanking. In 2015 now, Japanese right-wing organizations managed to override the school system of Japan, and all teaching in textbooks of these events are banned in Japan. So you cannot get a textbook in Japan that shows at that time, I think it might have been changed since, but there's been a huge fight about this in Japan. But Japanese people are not told about these events. They have no idea that these things occurred in World War II. And consequently, they're very, very upset when they go to Korea or they go to China and people don't seem to welcome them with open arms. Well, the reason is they don't know that what had happened previously to these people and how their government and their military had treated them. The Russians now, because again, they're not exactly the best friends of the Japanese, begin to send massive amounts of equipment and money to the Chinese government to help the Chinese continue to fight the Japanese. $250 million in war material and credits. This is in a kind of a blurry picture, but this is a Soviet-built I-16 fighter, and on the propeller, that flag is the flag of China, of nationalist China. Well, after Panay and after the incidents with Nanking, the US government, the British, and the French also begin to send aid to China. And they're sending it through Haiphong Harbor in what is at that time French Indochina, and as we probably all know, that is now in what was North Vietnam and now is in Vietnam. And so they are dropping in 10,000 tons a month of aid into China. Well, the main Chinese objective at this point is they know they don't have the power to defeat the Japanese in open battle, so they try this thing called magnetic warfare, where they try to get the Japanese to lure it into killing zones, and then they basically attack them. It's kind of like organized guerrilla warfare, the best way to put it. And in 1938, China begins to be a stalemate. Japan doesn't have enough troops or enough military power to actually control China, and the Chinese just continue to resist. So, what are the numbers? From 1937 to 1941, 185,647 Japanese soldiers are killed, 520,000 are wounded. Disease causes critical losses of just in the north, 430,000. So you can see that this war has become a huge, huge thing to Japan. They're taking massive casualties. It's dragging on. Remember, we're supposed to only go on for 3 months. And this is a big problem. Well, what about the Chinese? There is no accurate number of Chinese losses, but the belief is that they lost in this war 20 million people. The Japanese are the world leaders in biological warfare. They do indeed use biological attacks, including things called flea bombs. So they created a bomb that would disperse fleas that carried bubonic plague. They had a policy in the north, again, called the Three Alls. They were so desperate to get China to quit, they said, we're going to kill all, loot all, and burn all to get the Chinese to stop this war. And as I told you earlier, if you look at the map, they captured all that territory and all the major coastal cities. And still the Chinese refused to quit. Yes?
That would seem that they had changed their philosophy of war to extermination. They were exterminating the Chinese.
Yes, the question is they changed their philosophy of war because they were exterminating Chinese. And the reason they were exterminating Chinese is they resisted. This was not extermination. This was compassionate killing for people that didn't want to be under the control, the great auspices of the emperor.
That explains it.
Thank you so much. All right. That leads us to the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. And the Khalkhin Gol, by the way, is a river. That's in the Mongolian People's Republic, the MPR. And you can see that once again, our good friends, the Imperial Way and the Kwantung Army have reared their head, even in 1939, while China's battle is going on. They get it in their heads that, you know, this might be a good time to invade Russia. Okay, hey, and here's the plan. So they're going to go all the way from, they're going to take Vladivostok, they're going to basically take everything they had right after World War I back, and perhaps even go a little further. So, because they believe that the Soviets are a huge threat, and the Imperial Army believes this as well, because there's possibility of submarines, and Vladivostok is not real far from Japan, so you could have bombers come in. And the Japanese know that the Chinese, or excuse me, the Russians have a significant air power, and they're concerned about Russia being on their doorstep, considering that Russia is supporting the Chinese. Russia has been their traditional enemy since 1904, and they don't really like each other. It's simple. But the Kwantung Army, again, without orders, decides to start a bunch of incursions, I guess, around Mongolia. And they think that the USSR is too weak because Stalin has purged the Russian officer corps. So they, again, think this is a golden opportunity for them to take some free stuff, because they love free stuff. Well, we have Japanese tanks in Mongolia, and this actually will turn into the largest tank battle in the world up to this time. It continues to escalate, but the Japanese are actually repulsed by the Russians. The Russians fight very hard, and a stalemate happens. Well, what do the Russians do? They bring in a guy you may be familiar with, Georgy Zhukov. You may know that Georgy Zhukov was the Russian general who defeated the Germans at Stalingrad. He was also the conqueror of Berlin in 1945. So he's quite a good general. And they heavily reinforce his troops. What the Japanese don't realize is that the Russians have brought in a lot of trucks. The nearest railroad is a long way from where this battle is. So the Japanese are pretty complacent about the fact that the Russians won't be able to bring in heavy reinforcements. The Russians bring in a bunch of trucks and drive in reinforcements. So the Russian army is vastly more mobile than the Japanese, and they have better tanks. Big tank battle, but they got better ones. So the Kwantung Army begins to actually launch air raids. That's the one bright spot in this whole thing for the Japanese. The Japanese Army Air Force does perform very well. And they start launching attacks on Russia itself, not the Mongolian People's Republic. Well, remember, we're fighting in China here, so the Japanese Imperial Army is like going, no, don't do this. We don't need to have a major battle. We don't need to have a major war with Russia. We can't afford this. So they're ordered to stop. But then Zhukov launches an attack that is extremely reminiscent of what he did at Stalingrad, launching from two separate sides to surround the Japanese division. He surrounds that division and destroys it. It's the largest tank battle in history. Like I said, that's a destroyed Japanese tank. They're soundly defeated by superior Russian, the fact that they're more mobile and have better tanks. The Kwantung Army is forced to stop their provocations, and the ongoing war with China becomes much more important now, and the Japanese military begins to look more and more to the south. They realize that the Russians are too tough a nut to crack, and they don't really want to get involved with it. And then, on the same day that Zhukov has his victory, the Russians and the Germans invade Poland. So you can see that the Russians are really not into having a big battle in the east either, because they've got bigger fish to fry in Europe. They are now carving up Poland with the Germans. In 1940, this is September 27th, so France has already been defeated. Keep that in mind. And by the way, it's mandatory for all World War II lectures to have a picture of Hitler, so this is it. So there he is. So France has fallen, and the Axis powers control Europe, and this gives Japan the feeling that they can control Asia. So they occupy northern Indochina on September 22nd of 1940. Remember, the French government is the Vichy government. So the Vichy government has control of French colonies, and the Japanese occupy North Vietnam only to prevent more supplies getting into the Chinese. And here are the Tripartite Pact Articles. Article 1, Japan recognizes and respects the leadership of Germany, Italy, in the establishment of a new order in Europe. And, in reciprocation, Germany and Italy recognize a new order in Asia. And the U.S. is like, this sucks, okay? So they decide that, you know what, we are not into this whatsoever, and they condemn the pact, and they also condemn the Indochina invasion, and that leads to huge, huge amounts of tension between the United States and Japan. Not to mention we don't like Germany very much. Well, that brings us to the Japanese dream of the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Now remember we talked about Hakuichu. That's 8 corners of the world under one roof, and that's attributed to Emperor Jimmu. And he said, theoretically, again, this is oral tradition, I shall cover the 8 directions and make them my abode. So in other words, that he would be the emperor over the entire world. Well, the Germans in 42 and the Japanese and the Italians decided that they would come up with a new border. And the new border would be 70 east. So basically, this half of the world is Japan's, and this half of the world, or not the Western Hemisphere, excuse me, this half of this landmass becomes German and Italian, and that would become Japanese. They want to create, again, a new order in the East, and this would bring a people under the emperor's fatherly benevolence. And again, to Mr. Barber's comments, force is justified against you if you resist, because you don't want to be part of the empire. So that's kind of what that would have looked like. Konoe dissolves all political parties in 1940, so Japan now is on a complete war footing. It is what they call a national defense state. So we've gotten rid of all those political parties. We don't need them. And they create this secret military agreement, like I said, in January of 42, to create the world domination of these two powers. Well, after Calc and Gold, don't you find it interesting that now we're going to have a Soviet-Japanese neutrality pact? And this is right before the German invasion of Russia. So the Japanese goals is, we don't want to fight the Russians, they're tough, and they want freedom of action, and they want to take the southern resource area. The southern resource area would be French Indochina, Malaysia, Burma, into India, but particularly the Dutch East Indies, which are rich in oil. Indonesia today. Russian goals, simple enough, they don't want to be fighting the Japanese. They got bigger fish to fry with the Germans on their border, even though theoretically they are allies at this time. The Germans are all in favor of this. Strangely enough, you would think that they would have preferred the Japanese to go after the Russians, but they are more concerned about the U.S. giving lend-lease aid to Britain, and so they hope that indeed the Japanese will get into a fight with the U.S., and that will prevent the U.S. from supporting Britain. Article 2, the contracting parties, and I think this is really, really interesting, is that they will observe neutrality regardless if they're in a conflict with another party. So basically, if the Russians and Germans are fighting, even though the the Japanese are part of the tripartite pact, they will not get involved in the war with Russia and Germany. And this is actually followed. So what happens is the U.S. throughout the war is sending lend-lease aid to Russia right past Japan. Now, it's not on U.S. ships, it's on Russian ships. And where do the Russians get the ships? We give it to them. We can't send military aid, we can't send them guns and tanks, but we can send them trucks. We can send them locomotives. We can send them food. So all through the war, 50% of the Lend-Lease aid the United States gives to Russia sails right past Japan. And the Japanese let it go. And I've asked you if you wanted to read a book by a gentleman called Richard B. Frank. And that's a book called Downfall. And I had a conversation just a few weeks ago with Richard Frank in this regard. I said, well, you know, what do you think about this? And he said, to me, he said he really felt that the Japanese still considered that the the Russians were too strong in Manchuria to get involved with another fight with them. So what they thought was, he thought, is that they basically let this go just so they could avoid conflict with Russia rather than get involved with another foe. So it kind of shows you that the Japanese maybe weren't the best ally the Germans ever had. So the Japanese, like I had mentioned, invade northern Indochina, and that's in June of 1940, right after the fall of France. They begin to go into there in September. So they put in 40,000 troops. The French reluctantly agree to this, and they now can cut off Haiphong Harbor from supplying weapons to the Chinese. Well, after the German invasion of Russia on June 21st of 1941, Japan moves 140,000 troops into Indochina, and this forces the U.S. and Britain and Dutch to respond. So if you look at this, you can see South Vietnam and British Malaysia and Singapore are really close. And the Japanese probably didn't need 140,000 troops to occupy this little country, especially since it's really controlled by the French. So the British and the U.S. and the Dutch are pretty much aware that the Japanese are up to something going south. Well, the U.S. response to this is in 1940, remember the first time when they take the northern part of the country, they embargo scrap metal and shipments to Japan, and they close the Panama Canal to Japanese shipping. When they have the big one in July 24th of 41, where they put 140,000 troops in, we hit them very hard when we embargo, well, we freeze all their cash, first of all. And then we embargo all their oil and gasoline. And they get 80% of those supplies from the United States. And the rest they get pretty much from the Dutch. So the Dutch go along with this too. So consequently now the Japanese have absolutely no oil or gasoline coming into their country. They only have a 2-year supply of fuel to maintain their military. They're fighting a war in China, and they need to get oil right away. They certainly can't consider fighting Russia because that won't get them any oil. Where can they get oil? The southern resource area. The Dutch have plenty of oil. The Dutch have been conquered by the Germans, and the Dutch are ripe for their taking. Of course, if they do that, they will have to fight Britain, and they believe they will have to fight the United States. May not have had to fight the United States, but they believe that. So Japan makes the decision to go south really in the 25th of June 1940 when Army Minister Hata says, remember, France has just fallen, so the bet is that Germany is going to beat Britain. Seize this golden opportunity. Don't let anything stand in the way. Remember, the Dutch are conquered, the French are conquered, the British are on the ropes. Then, on the 1st of November 41, with the Russians being destroyed by they think, by the Germans, they think this is even a better opportunity. So now they say, now is the time. If we take the South, we will be able to strike a strong blow against the American resources of national defense. That is, we will build an iron wall. They will build a defensive strategy to keep the U.S. out of Asia, and with it we will destroy one by one the enemy states of Asia. So in other words, states that support white colonial rule. And in addition, we will defeat America and Britain. This whole gamble is based on Germany. Germany will defeat Russia. Germany will defeat Britain. Unfortunately, Germany doesn't defeat Russia and Britain. So this is a disaster for the Japanese. And our ambassador to Tokyo, Joseph Grew, makes this statement at the time. The German military machine and system have gone to the Japanese head like strong wine. Well, we've got negotiating positions because the Japanese are still not sold on this totally because they know this is a big risk. So Japan says to the United States, well, look, you leave us alone in China, we'll keep China, and you know what? Like 25 years from now, we'll give Indochina back to the French. That's pretty much their negotiating position. The U.S. says, well, you know, we don't think that's so much of a deal. We want you to abandon the tripartite pact. You have to get completely out of China, You got to return to the open door, and oh, by the way, you got to give Indochina back to the French. Japanese absolutely refuse to consider getting out of China by the fact that they've already had, like I said, 500,000 casualties fighting the war in China. They are not going to give it up. Konoe wants to meet with Roosevelt, even proposes that Roosevelt meet with the emperor. But the U.S. says, no, we are not going to do this unless there's an agreement in place first. If we have an agreement in place first, then we will have this ceremonial meeting, and we can, at that point, you know, all shake hands and be happy. Well, the U.S. is actually stalling the negotiations because what we're trying to do is we're trying to build up our forces in the Philippines because we think if we build up the forces in the Philippines, it will back the Japanese down. It's the same reason that we have moved our ships to Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was not our major base. Our major base was in the U.S. West Coast at San Francisco. But Roosevelt, for political reasons, moves the U.S. fleet to Pearl Harbor. Same idea here. Well, Konoe is forced out as prime minister, and the Navy, realizing that the U.S. is getting more and more powerful, demands that they begin the attack immediately. And the emperor tells Tojo, he goes, look, we need to continue to negotiate. This is very risky. This is a very dangerous thing to have this war. And what happens is they give the emperor this story. They present to the emperor what is known as the sick patient story. So the empire, the Japanese empire, is so sick because of the problems with the United States embargo that it is going to die. But there's a slim chance that we can save the country if indeed we have this operation. And of course, that operation will be war with the United States. Tojo becomes prime minister. He agrees to continue negotiations until the end of November 41. And while those negotiations are taking place, the Japanese fleet is on its way to Pearl Harbor, and we all know what happens next. So, does anybody have any questions? Yes?
How far ahead did the Japanese plan for the attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent attack on Wake Island and Midway? I assume they had some sort of contingency plan set up beforehand?
Okay, the question is, how long in advance did the Japanese plan to attack Pearl Harbor and places like Midway or Wake Island, etc.? Particularly the Philippines would be probably more appropriate. And they actually began planning, as my memory serves me, I can't tell you the exact date, but I would say early spring of 41, the ideas began fermenting. And they had, of course, certain major technical difficulties with this. In other words, Pearl Harbor, as I told you in my other class, is extremely shallow, and it was dependent on torpedo attacks on U.S. ships, and they had to develop torpedoes that would run shallow enough to sink battleships in 40 feet of water. And they created a torpedo. Actually, they had the torpedo, but they created a different thing. Most people think it's a tail fin. There's two little side fins on a Japanese aerial torpedo that stabilized it when it hit the water. So basically, if a torpedo hits the water and it's on an angle, if you immediately put the tail up, it's not going to go straight, it's going to go to the right or to the left if it doesn't land flat. So there's two little gyroscopically controlled fins on the sides of a Japanese torpedo. They put wooden slats on those to make them more aerodynamic, so when the torpedo dropped, those gyroscopic flaps would automatically begin to work and the torpedo would land flatter. When that torpedo landed flat, immediately the tail could go up and it would run shallow. So that was actually not capable of being produced until the part of the Japanese fleet that was already on its way to Pearl Harbor. The Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi actually had to wait another day for Mitsubishi to provide more torpedoes. So hopefully that's your answer.
Thank you.
Anything else? All right, how about a review? I got a couple minutes. All right, Kokutai, or national polity, is the basis for Japanese government and control of Asia by right-wing factions. It's derived from the divinity of the emperor, keep that in mind, and it is the guiding principle of life in Japan from 1873 till 1945. Kokutai, national polity. You'll hear this over and over and over again at the end of the war. Gekkokujo. Hey, we can do whatever we want because we have moral principles. So moral principle is more important than law. And it leads to continuous, what is commonly known in Japan as government by assassination. And, you know, if the emperor agrees to it, it must be okay. But if we don't like the emperor, we'll get a new one. And then the Japanese are extremely anti-communist. And primarily they're anti-communist because communism has a nasty tie-in with regicide. For example, we may remember in 1918, the Reds did execute the Tsar and his family. Japan invades Manchuria in 1931, goes to war with China in 1937. Their brutality in this war really changed U.S. public opinion about the Japanese. We were outraged by the Panay incident. We were outraged by Nanking. And we got closer and closer to war with the U.S. and Great Britain. And Japan has made the decision to go south, actually, I think, in 1940. Now, this is interesting. I'll just real quickly. In 1941, when the Germans invade Russia, there's a faction, not necessarily the Imperial Way faction, but a faction within the Japanese army that says, you know, this might be a good idea. Let's forget about going south like we've been planning on. Why don't we just invade Russia? Because they're so busy with the Germans that this might be a good opportunity to get a land grab. Well, that's true, but before they could really put that planning into place, that oil thing reared its ugly head. So they didn't have oil to have a fight with Japan, a fight with Russia, and there are no prospects of getting oil from the Germans, because the nearest oil in Russia was in Baku down a single railway line, and that's not going to supply Japan with enough oil. So that thought, you always hear this in you know, counterfactual history about the fact that, well, Japan should have invaded Russia. Well, it would have been nice if they could invade Russia if they had a supply of oil, but we made sure they didn't. So with it, thank you, and I hope to see you all next week.